The medical reports and the encyclopedias will look you in the eye and lie to you. They will tell you that Dean Martin, the man who made a tuxedo look like pajamas and a martini glass look like an extension of his hand, died on Christmas Day, 1995. They will cite acute respiratory failure. They will talk about the emphysema that stole the breath from the lungs that once sang, "That's Amore." And technically, medically, they are correct. But anyone who was actually there, anyone who saw the light vacate his eyes long before his heart stopped beating, knows the terrible truth. The man didn't die in 1995. That was just a formality. The real Dean Martin, the one who laughed, the one who ruled Hollywood without ever seeming to try, died 8 years earlier, on a freezing, blindingly white Saturday in March 1987. He died the moment a telephone rang in his Beverly Hills fortress and ripped the soul straight out of his chest. Because on that day, the king of cool didn't lose his fame. He didn't lose his fortune, and he didn't lose his voice. He lost the only thing that made the game worth playing. He lost his son. And when the music stops for a man like Dean Martin, it doesn't fade out gently, it crashes into a silence so loud it can shatter a mountain. This is not just a story about a celebrity tragedy. This is the untold anatomy of a father's silent scream that lasted for nearly a decade. This is the story of how the coolest man who ever lived froze to death in the California sun. To truly understand the devastation that turned a legend into a ghost, you have to peel back the layers of the myth. You have to ignore the Dino persona, the boozy, slurry, happy-go-lucky character he played on stage with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. That was an act. A brilliant, million-dollar act. The real Dean Martin was a man of profound privacy, a man who built a fortress of solitude around himself that even his wives couldn't penetrate. He was a man who would finish a show in Las Vegas, bypass the parties, and go back to his room to watch old westerns and eat a ham sandwich alone. He kept the world at arm's length. But there was one person, just one, for whom he lowered the drawbridge. One person who had the keys to the castle. His son, Dean Paul Martin. They called him Dino Jr., but to Dean, he was simply the boy. And in the constellation of the Martin family, Dino was the supernova. He was everything Dean was, and everything Dean secretly wished he could be. Handsome. He had his father's dark Italian eyes and effortless charm. Talented. He was a Golden Globe-nominated actor, starring in films like Players and cult TV hits like Misfits of Science. Athletic. He played tennis at Wimbledon. Musical. He had his own rock band in the 60s. But what made Dean look at his son with a reverence that bordered on worship wasn't the showbiz glitter. It was the fact that Dino was real. While Dean spent his life pretending, wearing masks, and playing the drunk, Dino was out there doing the things Dean only watched in movies. Dino was a captain in the California Air National Guard. He didn't just play a pilot on TV, he flew F-4 Phantom jets, Mach 2 monsters of steel and fire. The bond between them was visceral. It wasn't the typical Hollywood father-son dynamic fraught with jealousy and competition. It was a pure, unadulterated friendship. Dean, who famously hated confrontation and deep conversations, could talk to Dino for hours. They played golf together at the Riviera Country Club, moving across the greens in a rhythm that only they understood. Dean would watch his son swing a club or serve a tennis ball, and you could see the "King of Cool" mask slip just a fraction. Underneath, there was just a dad, bursting with a pride so intense it scared him. "That's my boy," he would tell the guys at the bar, pointing to a photo of Dino in his flight suit, a photo he kept closer than his credit cards. "He flies jets. I just sing songs. He's the real hero." Dino was Dean's anchor. In a world of fake smiles, mafia handshakes, and studio contracts, Dino was the one true thing. He was Dean's proof that he had done something right. But the universe has a cruel sense of irony. It often takes the things we love the most and turns them into the instruments of our destruction. March 21, 1987, began as a quintessential Los Angeles day. The palm trees were swaying, the air was mild, and in Beverly Hills, Dean was settling into his weekend routine, likely nursing a soft drink, because the booze was mostly a prop, and waiting for a golf game on TV. But 60 miles away, in the San Bernardino Mountains, the sky was preparing a massacre. A freak, violent winter storm was swirling around the peaks of Mount San Gorgonio, the highest point in Southern California. The mountain, a jagged wall of granite rising over 11,000 feet, was disappearing behind a curtain of blinding snow and clouds. Captain Dean Paul Martin and his weapons system officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, were on the tarmac at March Air Force Base. They were strapped into their F-4C Phantom, a heavy, powerful beast of the Vietnam era. They were, the Ghosts, part of the 163rd Tactical Fighter Group. The mission was routine, a departure procedure that would take them up through the cloud layers and out towards the training ranges in the Mojave Desert. They had done this 100 times. But nature doesn't care about your flight hours, and it certainly doesn't care who your father is. As they taxied to the runway, the visibility was dropping rapidly. The world was turning into a gray, featureless void. At 1:52 p.m., the radio crackled. Dino requested a left turn from air traffic control to avoid the towering, ominous thunderheads that were blocking their path. The controller approved the turn. Phantom 6, turn left heading 280. Dino acknowledged. Those were the last words he would ever speak to the outside world. In the disorientation of the storm, amidst the swirling, whiteout conditions where the sky and the ground look exactly the same, something went terribly wrong. The jet, traveling at over 400 miles per hour, covering a football field every second, didn't turn away from the mountain. It turned directly into it. Dean Martin was likely lighting a cigarette at that exact moment, safe in his living room, completely unaware that his heart was about to stop beating. He didn't feel the impact. He didn't hear the explosion. But up on that frozen ridge, reality ended. The F-4 Phantom slammed into the sheer granite face of San Gorgonio at high velocity. There was no time to eject. No time to scream. No time to be afraid. The physics of the crash meant that Dino and Ramon were gone before their brains could even register the impact. The explosion was muffled by the heavy snow, a silent fireball quickly extinguished by the blizzard. The wreckage was instantly buried under feet of fresh powder. The mountain had swallowed them whole. Back at the base, the radar blip vanished. 1 second it was there, pulsing with life and speed, the next, just the empty, green glow of the screen. Phantom 6, come in. Phantom 6, do you read? The controllers called out into the void. Once. Twice. 10 times. The only answer was the hiss of static. And in that static lay a nightmare that would destroy the Martin family forever. The phone in Beverly Hills hadn't rung yet. The silence in the house was still peaceful. But the news was traveling. It was moving through the chain of command, from the tower to the commander, and eventually, to the phone line that led to 512 Mountain Drive. When the phone finally rang, Dean picked it up with his usual casual demeanor. Maybe it was Frank. Maybe it was his agent. But the voice on the other end was stiff, formal, and terrifying. It was an official from the Air National Guard. Mr. Martin, your son's plane is missing. Missing. That word is a torture device. It implies hope, but it carries the weight of doom. It suggests that he might be walking down a trail, or waiting by a fire. But deep down, in the reptilian part of his brain, Dean knew. He felt the cold settle into his bones. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure of himself. He hung up the phone and stood there, paralyzed, as his world tilted on its axis and began to slide into hell. For the next 3 days, Dean Martin entered a purgatory that no writer could adequately describe. The storm on the mountain was so severe, so ferocious, that search and rescue teams couldn't even get near the crash site. Helicopters were grounded. Foot patrols were turned back by the threat of avalanches and zero visibility. Dean sat in his living room, a prisoner of the weather report. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He chain-smoked pack after pack of Kents, the blue smoke creating a haze around him that matched the fog in his mind. He stared at the television, watching the weather maps, willing the clouds to part. Friends came by. The royalty of Hollywood. Frank Sinatra, devastated and frantic, called constantly. Jerry Lewis, with whom Dean had shared a complicated, broken history, reached out. But Dean barely spoke. He was catatonic. He wasn't the superstar anymore, he was just a frightened father trembling in his pajamas. He paced the floor of his mansion, walking miles on the expensive carpets, muttering prayers he hadn't said since he was a boy in Steubenville, Ohio. Please, God. Take the money. Take the house. Take the voice. Just give me the boy. Let him be cold, let him be hurt, but let him be alive. But God wasn't bargaining that week. The storm raged on, a white fury covering the mountain in a shroud of secrecy, hiding the wreckage and the truth from the desperate father. Every hour that passed without news was a physical torture session. The not knowing was a razor blade slicing through Dean's sanity, minute by agonizing minute. He would pour a drink, look at the amber liquid, and put it down with a shudder, feeling guilty for even thinking of comfort while his son might be freezing to death on a granite ledge. Finally, on the third day, the sky cleared. The search helicopters lifted off from the base, their rotors chopping through the heavy silence. They spotted the scar on the mountain face almost immediately. A blackened smear on the pristine white snow. They found the wreckage. There was no parachute. There was no campsite. There was no miracle. When the confirmation came, that Dino was gone, that he had died instantly upon impact, Dean didn't scream. He didn't throw a glass against the wall. He simply collapsed inward. It was as if the invisible strings that had held his puppet body together for 70 years had been cut all at once. The light in his eyes, that mischievous, "I know something you don't know," twinkle that had charmed the world since 1946, flickered out and died. He hung up the phone and sat in his favorite chair, staring at a blank television screen. The silence in that room was deafening. It wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a heart breaking beyond repair. He told the people around him to leave. He wanted to be alone. He needed to be alone with the ghost that had just moved in. The funeral was a blur of black limousines, weeping celebrities, and military honors. A folded American flag, the haunting sound of taps played on a lonely bugle echoing across the cemetery. Dean Martin was there physically, but spiritually, he was miles away. He moved like a robot, his movements stiff and mechanical. He wore his dark glasses not to look cool, not to build the mystique, but to hide eyes that were swollen, red, and utterly dead. People tried to comfort him with clichés. He died a hero, they said. He didn't suffer, they promised. Dean nodded politely, the gentleman to the end, but he didn't hear them. All he could hear was the silence where his son's laugh used to be. At the graveside, witnesses saw something that would haunt them forever. Dean, the man who never showed emotion, walked up to the casket. He placed his hand on the cold wood, a gentle, lingering touch, as if he were tucking Dino in for the night one last time. He leaned in and whispered something. No one knows for sure what it was. Maybe it was, "I love you." Maybe it was, "Wait for me." After the funeral, Dean retreated into his fortress on Mountain Drive and shut the gates. He stopped returning calls. He stopped going out to dinner. He stopped being Dean Martin. The world wanted him back, the fans clamored for the crooner, the networks wanted the specials, but Dean felt betrayed by life. He had played by the rules. He had worked hard, he had provided, he had entertained millions, and this was his reward? To bury his child? It made no sense to him. It was a cruel, cosmic joke, and for the first time in his life, Dean didn't find the joke funny. He began to shed the trappings of his stardom like a snake shedding dead skin. He didn't care about the records. He didn't care about the ratings. He sat in his bedroom, watching old westerns on a loop. Why westerns? Because in westerns, the good guys won. In westerns, death had a reason. In westerns, the world was simple. The complex, painful reality of 1987 was too much to bear. A year later, in 1988, Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. tried to save him. They saw their friend fading away, literally dying of grief, and they came up with a plan, the Together Again tour. The Rat Pack, reunited. Stadiums, massive paychecks, the adoration of the crowd. Frank truly believed the applause would heal Dean. He thought the music would pump life back into his veins. But Frank was wrong. Frank didn't understand that Dean didn't want to be healed. He just wanted to be left alone. Dean agreed to the tour only out of loyalty. He didn't want to let Frank and Sammy down. But from the first night in Oakland, it was a disaster. Dean stood on stage, and he looked lost. He would forget lyrics he had sung for 30 years. He would flick his cigarette ashes onto the stage floor with a look of utter disdain for the whole charade. It reached a breaking point in Chicago. A few shows in, the cracks became canyons. Dean turned to Frank on stage, amidst the glare of the spotlights and the noise of the orchestra, and mumbled, "I want to go home." Frank tried to push him, tried to rally the troupe. "Come on, D, let's knock 'em dead." But Dean had nothing left to give. He threw his cigarette down, walked off the stage, and went straight to the airport. He flew home to Los Angeles that night, leaving the tour, leaving the money, leaving the legend behind forever. He checked into a hospital citing kidney problems, but everyone knew the truth. It was a soul problem. He was done. He had tried to be Dean Martin one last time for his friends, but the mask wouldn't stick anymore. That night in Chicago was the last time the Rat Pack ever existed. Dean walked away not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. The final 7 years of Dean Martin's life were a study in solitude. He didn't become a recluse in the crazy sense, he didn't grow a long beard or talk to walls. He just became a man who was finished with the noise. He established a quiet, heartbreaking routine. Every evening, he would shower, shave, and put on a tuxedo or a crisp sports coat, always dressing for dinner out of habit and self-respect. He would have his driver take him to his favorite Italian restaurant, usually La Famiglia or Da Vinci in Beverly Hills. He would walk in, and the staff knew exactly what to do. They would give him the corner table. They would bring him his pasta fagioli, his bread, and a glass of red wine. And every single night, Dean would have the waiter set a place setting for the empty chair opposite him. A plate, a fork, a glass. Some patrons whispered that he was waiting for Frank. Others thought he was waiting for a woman. But those who knew him understood the tragedy unfolding before their eyes. That empty chair was for Dino. He was having dinner with his son. He would sit there for hours, eating slowly, sipping his wine, staring into the middle distance, lost in a conversation that only he could hear. Fans would sometimes approach him, asking for an autograph. Dean would always be polite. He would sign the napkin, smile that sleepy, half-smile, and say, "You're welcome, pal." But the eyes were vacant. They were the eyes of a man who was just waiting for the check so he could go home. He spent his days playing golf until he became too weak to swing the club, then he just rode in the cart. Then he stopped going to the course altogether. He missed his friends. Sammy died in 1990, and that was another hammer blow to his fragile world, but mostly, he missed the boy on the mountain. He told a friend once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, "I'm not afraid of dying. Why should I be? Everyone I love is already there." It was a profound statement of faith and fatigue. The king of cool had become a monk of grief, finding a strange comfort in his loneliness. He was serving out his time. He was a prisoner of existence, waiting for parole. And then, the end finally came. It was Christmas Day, 1995. A poetic date for a man who had made Marshmallow World and Baby, It's Cold Outside into holiday anthems. Dean Martin lay in his bed at 512 Mountain Drive. His breathing was shallow. The emphysema caused by a lifetime of cigarettes had claimed his lungs, but it was the grief that had claimed his will to breathe long ago. He was 78 years old. As the world outside celebrated, opening presents and singing carols, Dean Martin closed his eyes. There was no struggle. There was no panic. Just a gentle exhaling, a final release of the burden he had carried for 8 long years. The silence he had sought for so long finally embraced him completely. When the news broke, the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor, a tribute reserved for the gods of entertainment. The world mourned the loss of an icon. Frank Sinatra, devastated and frail, wept for his brother. But for those who really loved Dean, there was a sense of relief. They knew that he wasn't suffering anymore. They knew that somewhere in the great beyond, the pilot had landed, and the Father was waiting at the gate. The tragic irony of Dean Martin's life is that he spent 40 years trying to make us laugh, but his story ended in tears. Yet, in that tragedy, there is a beautiful lesson. It teaches us that fame is nothing. Money is dust. Awards are just metal. The only thing that truly matters, the only thing that can break a man like Dean Martin, is love. He loved his son so much that he couldn't survive without him. And that, in its own heartbreaking way, is the most noble legacy of all. So the next time you hear, "That's Amore," don't just hear the jokes and the Italian charm. Listen to the voice. Listen to the warmth. And remember the man who died of a broken heart on a snowy mountain, and the father who spent his last years staring at an empty chair, waiting for his boy to come home. Rest in peace, Dino. You finally got your wings.